to be a guest, I'm just gonna launch while you're doing that, and we'll be good to go. To be a guest at the welcoming table that this conference has set is a gift, and I'm grateful for the chance to be here to learn from you all. I do work in childhood studies, and so my approach to reading texts broadly construed originated first in the localized economic depressions that shaped my family's history in my own childhood, and then as a young high school English teacher concurrently pursuing graduate study with my interest in the ways American literature and culture signifies poverty on bodies and in language and in classrooms and in curricula. What happens, I'm interested in, when we reread The Poor Child against the cultural narratives that have always governed our nation's response or indifference to those in poverty. So today, I'm inviting you to the children's table, a pun that I cannot claim as my own, where I'm interested in reading images of children in poverty in Twain's Adaptation network. My line of inquiry builds from others who have found children generative entry points to Twain, specifically Shelley Fisher Fishkin's work with Twain's source material for Huck and his language, and Scott McCloud's discussion of it as a boys' book, and more recently Andrew Levy's insistence in Huck Finn'S America that understanding how childhood was changing in Twain's time helps us understand Huck Finn. Childhood, you see, is a cultural construction just as race and class are. As I'm not a Twain scholar, my efforts here are to, through a recent children's book, find a small corner of the conversation in which to enter. As you all don't need me to say, there isn't such thing as a small corner of Twain, so I'm grateful today to gain your feedback on my draft thinking. And as I've worked on what I proposed for this conference with what I'm sharing with you today, you'll see soon my realization that I think I have two projects here. So in the end, they're both, though, concerned with the same question. What does it mean for illustrations of children in poverty to be sites of cultural negotiation? While much has been written about illustrations of Twain's gem, it is less so for illustrations of Huck. There are a small handful of articles focused on Kimball's illustrations for the 1880s novel, and consistent mention of Rockwell's commissioned illustrations, which we'll see in just a bit. The most comprehensive treatment I found was Alison Enzer's 1985 catalog of illustrations, in which she occasionally and carefully offers a few opinions of the fidelity of certain illustrations across the first 100 years of the novel. She begins by reminding us that Huck gives no description of himself. Later editions and anthologies, she notes, are often without illustrations. However, if we're reading as everyone did 100 years ago, then our imagination is directed and supplemented by the artist's vision. It isn't new to talk about Huck as emblematic of American childhood, right? Stephen Mentz's oft-cited History of American Childhood is titled Huck's Raft. Mentz writes, quote, "For over a century, Huck has served as a lightning rod for popular fantasies and anxieties about childhood. As the ubiquity of Huck Finn demonstrates, texts are always in circulation within a culture and its lexicon, as no audience reads text simply as itself. Meaning does not emerge in isolation from the objects we read," Newell, an adaptation scholar, writes, "but instead is shaped by the strategies we deploy and the interpretive communities to which we belong. Similar to others who see adaptations as a continuum, I echo that we must move beyond fidelity criticism that emphasizes an original text and subsequent variations. Approaches of fidelity are how most of us read books that are adapted into television shows or movies or even children's books, and we say things like, alas, they can't change that, right? But through examining the authenticity of an adaptation can be a generative and logical first step. What if we see adaptations as one draft of many? Existing simultaneously, seeing drafts as parallel instead of a progress, right, requires readers to navigate and move between intersections of socially constructed concepts, race, class, gender, nation, childhood, etc. By focusing on illustrations of poor children, I'm foregrounding the body as, to borrow from Gavin Jones's American Hungers, quote, "the sight that bears the marks, the damage of being poor." So what does it mean to be a child in poverty in these illustrations? This is a longer project than today allows, but I'm going to offer you a few early 20th century illustrations for children as ways to think about how adaptation networks are a result of reiterative practices, a broad inventory of narrative moments, reference points, and iconography that come to be associated with a particular work. And I think come to help us see how childhood, right, American childhood has changed across time. So very quickly, this is a board game from 1920s. Does anyone have it? All right, I thought I'd try. So in the 20s, as more families ascended to the middle class, we see the rise of children as consumers. Toy industries boomed. Huck begins to consistently have bare feet. And we see a shift in his cultural iconography. At the end of the 30s, right, FDR outlawed child labor in 1938, so everything was fine, right? And a sentimental childhood was, in theory, accessible to all. And I don't think we can think of a sentimental childhood without thinking of Rockwell's illustrations. In the 1940s, right, Dwig's cartoons that he first began in the 1910s came back, and I didn't find the right ones for today, so my apologies. I'll send those later. But in these cartoons, we see a return to nationalism, right? And we see Dwig's depictions of Huck and Tom, often in other places with othered people. In the 1950s, we see an emphasis in American childhood on a rising middle class, right, on family life. Dr. Seuss's Readers for Children, right, became hugely popular in the 1950s, and those readers are all about the idea that children might misbehave and have a really good time doing so. And so what we see in 1950s adaptations of Huck for Children are a privilege privileging in the text Huck's adventures over all else. So there's so much to say, right, about these adaptations, and I just pulled a few images for you. But I'm going to offer you a close reading of one in particular, and that's a coloring book published in 1960, right, published at the end of the 1950s, where we saw, right, Huck's adventures being privileged. Robin Bernstein illustrates in her book, Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights, quote, "The method of reading material things as scripts aims to discover not what any individual actually did, but rather what a thing invited its users to do. This is not," she goes on to say, "to suggest that things possess agency or that people lack it, but instead to propose that agency emerges through constant engagement with the stuff of our lives, what we do with it." So I'm interested in exploring what the child was invited to do in the script of this particular adaptation. So, maybe, there we are. So that's the front, the cover of the coloring book. You'll note that there is no Jim, right? Huck has freckles, reddish brown hair, and his characteristic smile, and a dog. And then the title page, just the very next, right, shows us apparently that when Huck turns his head, he's missing a tooth, which wasn't front cover material. It had to go on the title page. The next thing I want to show you is that this was a child's coloring book, right? This actually belonged to Nancy Larson, 10, of Gainesville, Georgia. If anyone knows her, I'm happy to return it. But we see how she colored Huck, right? Same freckles, same reddish brown hair, right? We see the same Huck in how the child colored the coloring book. And then we see how the child chose to color Jim. This coloring book is an example of how children make meaning of cultural scripts and enact them too. Please know that I'm not suggesting that all children colored Huck in this way, nor am I suggesting that all children chose to use the black crayon for Jim, but this child did. What was Nancy invited into in this coloring book adaptation? In the story that's depicted at the bottom of these pages, there is no pap. The story ends differently with both Huck and Jim, quote, "not likely to roam for a long time." A child who smiles and has grand adventures is the center of this story. There's lasting power in the ways Huck has been visually represented, in the way his body bears the tensions of his poverty, tensions that have become more visible in his torn clothes and bare feet across time, and the beckon of a kind of childhood that is free to roam and explore. Yet it's important to note that American culture scripts Huck as white. Levy notes that Twain's Huck was Irish, then in that time considered, quote, a dark race. Fishkin unpacks Huck's language to remind us that the vernacular roots of Huck, of American literature itself, is black. Considering this, when I first read Erin and Phillip Stead's 2017 adaptation of an unpublished Twain story, I was struck by their decision to depict the poor child, Johnny, as black. 7 years earlier, a certain gentleman up here was the first to find the manuscript in the Twain papers. And what unfolded between 2010 and 2017 is John's story, but he's been gracious enough to share that with me as I've been working on this. The publisher's summary of the book, The Purloining of Prince Oleomargarine, I hadn't said oleo since my granny was alive, reads as follows. Johnny, forlorn and alone, except for his pet chicken, meets a kind woman who gives him seeds that change his fortune, allowing him to speak with animals and sending him on a quest to rescue a stolen prince. In the face of a bullying tyrant king, Johnny and his animal friends come to understand that generosity, empathy, and quiet courage are gifts more precious in this world than power and gold. Okay, that's the original. That's the typescript there. I missed a slide, sorry. This is far too small for anybody to see, so I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about it. The excerpts on the screen now are from a September 2017 New Yorker article in which John is quoted saying, "The choice to illustrate Johnny as black was without support in the source text." And Fishkin is quoted as saying that it did not do justice, right, to Twain's understanding of what it was like to be black in America. And when the New Yorker wanted a critical evaluation of the Stead's authorial and artistic choices, they rightfully called those two scholars. I don't know enough, right, to offer a judgment of that choice. Instead, I'm going to share with you my draft thinking about the why. In other words, I'm not concerned with saying whether the Stead should or shouldn't have illustrated Johnny as black. I'm interested in thinking about how their decision to do so helps us reread and return to the child in poverty as an ongoing site of cultural negotiation, a large burden for small bodies to bear. This all began when I wondered what I might see if I read Erin Stead's illustrations alongside the illustrations of Huck. I just lost my place, I'm so sorry. Looking at these two images, so here's the original Huck, there's Erin Stead's Johnny. I'd argue that Erin Stead's Johnny is informed by Kimball's Huck. Narrow build, brown pants, white shirt, suspenders, one or two depending on the picture, hat, leather shoes, carrying something that signifies a class position. I'd very quickly note that the Steads also add a grandfather to the story that reeks of Pap Finn. The major difference, of course, is race. In a 2017 interview with NPR, this is how the Steads responded to the question. Again, it's small, you can Google it. I'm going to read a few phrases from it. Phillip, who wrote the text, said, "It would be a bit ridiculous for there to be textual evidence. Twain was certainly progressive, but he didn't necessarily begin progressive." Erin, who made the illustrations, said, "He was the kid I saw." I think we're talking about it right now because we're living in a very politically charged time. Back to Phillip. 3 years ago when we began the project, it wasn't a political decision. And lastly, if we had chosen a white character as the main character, I'm not sure we'd be answering these questions, as white children aren't asked to be symbols of anything. 3 years ago, from this article, was 2014. 2014 in August was Ferguson. 2014 was when the children's book campaign We Need Diverse Books was launched. Phillip now cautions us that whiteness makes itself invisible and appears to make race and racism vanish. Bernstein puts it this way, quote, "Childhood innocence, itself raced white, itself characterized by the ability to retain racial meanings but hide them under claims of holy obliviousness, secured the unmarked status of whiteness and the power derived from that status." Let's surface the same questions. What does it mean to be a child in poverty in these illustrations? And what meaning does this text invite children to make? As much as Johnny dresses like Huck, other differences in word and image are pronounced. I think I'll put him back up there so you can see. Huck narrates his own story, Johnny does not. The very first illustrations of Huck insist on his smile. Johnny never smiles in the children's book. Huck makes many choices and is also the subject of choices of others. Johnny's choices are almost wholly made by his grandfather and by anthropomorphized animals in the story. Huck knows he is poor. Johnny doesn't, apparently, until page 48. On page 12, the reader is told that Johnny is luckless and hungry. But on page 48, Johnny, quote, realized the shabbiness of his own self and that he, quote, couldn't ignore his hunger. All book, Johnny is stooped, hunched, unsure, hesitant, timid, cautious, small, fragile. Okay? Again, I know you can't see all of these, but this is pretty much the rest of the illustrations of Johnny in the text. While Twain's draft does have Johnny ask the animals, "What must I do next?" later in the story, there isn't characterization in the draft that suggests the string of adjectives I just used to describe Johnny. Please know that I'm not suggesting that the Stead should have created a Huck, or that a child who is timid and hesitant and cautious is somehow bad or inauthentic. If so, I would have been in big trouble. Twain's draft centers the prince too. It's titled Oleomargarine, right? Twain's draft is also not in first person. All I'm asking us to consider is that Johnny is the child they created, the child Erin Stead saw when she began to draw. For the sake of time, I'm going to ask us to look at a specific detail from a 2-page spread near the end of the book. These are the giants that supposedly captured Prince Oleomargarine. Notice the ways Erin Stead drew the bodies of the young and the old, the vulnerable and those tasked with caregiving. All the children in this 2-page spread have someone physically touching them, keeping them safe. They're illustrated as protected, as part of a community. Yet as the story resolves, Johnny is left without a human family. The animals are his surrogate family. And there's a story, and when the giants ask if Johnny is going to reveal their secret place or if he hates them for their supposed role in capturing the prince, the young child, 2 things are of interest. There are 2 small paragraphs inserted in the story that interrupt it that say, "But before we find an answer for Johnny." So I'd ask you to notice that the author is finding language for the child, right? Is deciding what language the child will say. And then secondly, the preface to his answer is worth quoting at length. Quote, "Johnny took a deep breath to calm his nerves. Then he opened his mouth and discovered that words could save mankind from all its silly, ceaseless violence, if only mankind could say them once in a while and make them truly meant. He said, 'I am glad to know you.'" What a weight for the child to carry. Many childhood study scholars have written about how racial status underwrites class status. In the end, the question is this: how do these illustrations prompt us to read Johnny? How is Johnny's blackness supposed to inform our understanding of his poverty, of his childhood? This is a gorgeously illustrated book. I'm happy to let you take a look at it when the session's done. It's a book that tries to be careful in a lot of ways. It's a book that wants to take seriously the task of writing alongside Twain. They put Twain's name in the credits. But ultimately, it's a book about what I like to call, right, in my work, the cultural labor of the poor child. What made Erin Stead see this particular child in her head? Johnny isn't offered childhood at the end of the book, or a family. Though he tells the giants, "I'm glad to know you," and they weep, Johnny isn't invited to stay with these people. He's expected to learn moral lessons, to help others. It's the 19th century boy book, we might say, without the adventure. Illustrations of Huck and Johnny raise the questions: who has access to childhood? How do tensions of race and class inform the ways childhood emerges as a site of cultural negotiation? Mara Gubar, childhood studies scholar, reminds us that if we equate childhood with innocence, we're idealizing something unsustainable. Twain, according to the program, said it this way: what is the most rigorous law of our being? Growth. Levy argues that Twain was more radical in his views of childhood than in his views of race. Quote, Twain was focused on the child as an autonomous figure in American culture, both fulfilling and repudiating stereotypes. Twain refused to choose between genre conventions of his day. Reading images in Huck's Adaptation network show a cultural desire to hold on to the adventurous part of Huck and a willingness to and comfort in seeing his poverty as a silent part of that adventure. Reading these illustrations invites us to think about how Huck, the culture text, has lost the rich nuance of Huck, the character, as first conceived by Twain. Maybe, in the end, what was so unfamiliar to me when I first read The Purloining of Prince Oleomargarine was that, in the end, Johnny isn't a child at all, at least not a child of Twain's. The oft-debated end of Twain's novel finds Huck going to light out for the territory. Johnny's reward was supposed to be, for finding the prince in the story, money, a princess, and a home in the castle for life. Yet Susie, right, the skunk, knew that Johnny did not need money, or a princess, or even a home in the palace for life. This is a quote from the end of the book. But perhaps she also knew this. If she guided Johnny to the edge of the animal's world, and if she stood him up on a mountaintop looking down at the castle below, Johnny would have the courage and the bravery to continue on his own. Huck is running from something. Johnny doesn't get to choose. Perhaps the poor child most often exists in our literature and in our cultural texts as the site where we work out competing narratives of what it might mean to be a child, and what it means to be poor, and what it means to be black, and what it means to have the privilege of whiteness. These, then, are texts representative of the cultural labor of the poor child. Thank you.